Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with my colleague, Carla Hutton, Senior Regulatory Analyst for Bergeson and Campbell, to discuss emerging state PFAS restrictions. As many listeners appreciate, dozens of states are considering, and some have enacted, state restrictions on a wide variety of products with the goal of eventually prohibiting the sale of products that contain intentionally added PFAS. Several states have implemented regulatory provisions that require the reporting of the presence of PFAS intentionally added to products, the labeling of certain products as to the presence of PFAS in the product as soon as January of next year, and or prohibiting the sale of products containing intentionally added PFAS by 2032. Monitoring, understanding, and explaining the complex diversity of these state PFAS restrictions is Carla's superpower. Her encyclopedic knowledge of these restrictions and understanding the subtle but really important distinctions among the state programs is impressive. We discuss the most urgent and controversial programs in Minnesota and New Mexico, and a few other states as well, with a view to assist listeners with understanding the key areas of controversy and how best to prepare for some fast approaching deadlines. Now, here's my conversation with Carla Hutton. Carla, I've been looking forward to our conversation, and I'm sad to say very excited about talking about state PFAS restrictions. Thank you for being here today.
I'm thrilled to be here because I never get to talk about state PFAS restrictions. No one cares. No one has questions.
Well, we both know that that is entirely untrue. We have so much to cover because there's just a lot going on. So let's start with Minnesota, our favorite state. Companies got a bit of a breather when the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency postponed the reporting deadline from July 1, which is like tomorrow, to September 15th, 2026. What else do companies need to know right now?
Well, MPCA is continuing to get everything in line. So now there's a form to use to request an extension. Extension requests must be postmarked by August 16, 2026. Reporters making the request will need to provide information on the circumstances preventing timely reporting, such as having to follow up on incomplete supplier disclosures or having complex multi-tier supply chains. They'll have to explain their due diligence to date, including efforts to contact suppliers, and how the reporter plans to meet the reporting requirements within the requested extension period.
Carly, is there a limit to the length of the extension that a reporter can request, or are you eligible for multiple extension requests?
Minnesota will grant a one-time only 90-day extension. So if the extension is granted, reports will be due December 14th, 2026. Merry Christmas.
I hope listeners appreciate that September 15th, the new reporting deadline, is fast approaching. I'm not entirely sure all of our clients and listeners appreciate just how extensive this reporting deadline is. So it's good to know that there's an opportunity for a pushback putting you squarely in the holiday season. What about a waiver? Is that an option for our listeners?
It's an option, but at this time, I think it's one that's unlikely to be granted. To
Hmm.
obtain a waiver, a reporter has to describe publicly available records that contain substantially equivalent information. So, Maine first postponed and then significantly narrowed its reporting requirement and never posted those reports itself. Reports are not due in New Mexico until January 1, 2027. Reports for a handful of categories of consumer products are due in Connecticut by July 1, 2026. But with the exception of apparel, the products containing intentionally added PFAS that must be reported in Connecticut are banned in Minnesota. So if you are an apparel manufacturer that will be reporting in Connecticut, you might be able to request a waiver from Minnesota.
I just noticed the use of the term might, Carla. What's that all about?
Well, as of today's recording, and I did check this morning before we started, Connecticut has not yet posted details on how to submit information.
Hmm.
This past fall 2025, Connecticut released a draft reporting form for public comment. And so reporters would complete and then email that form to Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Now that Minnesota has an online reporting platform hosted by the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, will Connecticut switch how reports are made? Or will it postpone its July 1, 2026 deadline? I don't know. If DEEP doesn't publish the reports online, then is the information publicly available to obtain a waiver in Minnesota? Again, I don't know. And I feel like I'm lining up all these cliffhangers. Stay tuned next week.
Well, we've talked about starting a Netflix series on the wonderful world of state PFAS reporting because there is a lot of drama and uncertainty, and it goes well beyond the confines of our law firm, I think. So there's reporting for certain products due to Connecticut by July 1. In Minnesota, if a reporter wishes to request a waiver or extension of the September 15th, 2026 reporting deadline, then those requests must be postmarked by August 16th. What's next?
Well, the latest darling on the scene, New Mexico. Just last week, the New Mexico Environment Department, or NMED, published its final rule implementing the state's PFAS Protection Act. Under the regulation and also the statute, there's a January 1, 2027 reporting requirement, a January 1, 2027 labeling requirement, and a January 1, 2027 prohibition for certain products, among other things, but those are the first deadlines.
This all sounds so overwhelming, and I gave a presentation to a client group last week and saw both fear, anxiety, anger, and not a small amount of just pure surprise at the rapidity, the nearness, and the depth of some of these obligations. Let's try to sort this out because it sounds like a lot. Maybe we can start with the easiest first, since reports will be due to Minnesota by September 15th of this year or December 14th of this year, if you have the advantage of an extension. Those reports will be available online and publicly available. Will companies have to report all over again?
I don't think so. For the most part, New Mexico has a few provisions that should help reporters. New Mexico's statute exempts certain products from reporting, and the one that's gotten a lot of attention has been products that contain fluoropolymers.
Mhm.
But there's motor vehicles, watercraft, I think pesticides. It's a dozen or so different categories. NMED can also waive the reporting requirement if it determines that substantially equivalent information is publicly available. And Minnesota has already started making reports available online. Uh, Minnesota and New Mexico have similar but not identical definitions for intentionally added, however. So while byproducts and impurities do not need to be reported to Minnesota, if the byproducts or impurities are expected, then I think they need to be reported in New Mexico. NMED can also enter into an agreement with one or more states and accept information reported to a shared system. And I think Minnesota's reporting system with the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse should fit that bill.
You just alluded to something that we lawyers kind of get hung up on, and that is that states have similar but not identical definitions. What does intentionally added mean in the Minnesota law, and is it the same, or is the term defined identically under the New Mexico law? And what other terms, in addition to what is intentionally added, PFAS, what's a fluoropolymer, what should listeners be on the lookout for?
Minnesota defines intentionally added PFAS as PFAS deliberately added during the manufacture of a product where the continued presence of PFAS is desired in the final product or one of the product's components to perform a specific function. New Mexico's definition is very similar, but it also includes PFAS used during manufacture where the continued presence is desired or expected. And so in New Mexico, that would capture things like PFAS used in a mold release agent, where the manufacturer does not want PFAS in the final product. But if it expects PFAS to be present, then New Mexico would define that to be intentionally added. So, um, things to look for in the definition of intentionally added. Um, how is manufacture defined? Uh, does it include the process? It means needing to know specifically how the PFAS are used. I don't think you can just ask a supplier. You need to be more specific about the process, where and how the PFAS are going in. We've had some questions about packaging, and I think states are sort of um, out of step with each other on that front as well. So companies need to look to the statute and the regulation overall and see what else is at play.
I kind of thought we were starting with the easiest, but this sounds very complicated. You spend an awful lot of time parsing these state restrictions and requirements, writing about it, e- answering client questions. For people that are coming to this new, you might need to retain a chemical engineer to discern what the PFAS might include, what its functionality may be. If I recall, some of these state obligations require the reporting of that information. So I would imagine this is for people who don't live and breathe this stuff 24/7, this probably is coming as a shock. I will also guess that the New Mexico January 1, 2027 prohibitions are less complicated than the labeling requirement. Do New Mexico's prohibitions overlap with Minnesota and Maine, for example?
They do. So beginning January 1, 2027, New Mexico will prohibit intentionally added PFAS in cookware, food packaging, dental floss, juvenile products, and firefighting foam. Unlike Minnesota, though, New Mexico will accept proposals for currently unavoidable use or CUU determinations for these products. Because of the tight time frame, CUU proposals for these products are due October 31, 2026. NMED will consider the proposals approved pending review and intends to issue a final determination by March 1, 2027. Some products are also exempt from the prohibition requirements, such as fluoropolymers and the other dozen or so categories. So no CUU determination is necessary for a pan with a Teflon coating, for example.
So CUU, the currently unavoidable use determination, that's an administrative decision, right? You just can't say this is currently a currently unavoidable use. That's not self-assigning you. That's a government determination. Is that correct?
Correct. As those who applied in Maine unfortunately learned, I think maybe out of 11 applications this summer, only 2 were granted. So it's not just a matter of filling out paperwork and to
Right.
check a box. Um, Companies or manufacturers will need to substantiate uh, why the use is necessary, why there's not um, a less risky or hazardous
Non-PFAS.
alternative to PFAS.
Right. So for New Mexico, we've covered the January 1, 2027 reporting and prohibition requirements. I don't want to say we've saved the best for last because we've already heard a lot from clients, but let's move to the January 1, 2027 labeling requirement. The term label might come as a shock to some of our listeners because it hasn't been an issue up until recently. the requirements for products manufactured after January 1, 2027 is what's staring us down in New Mexico. You also mentioned that New Mexico exempts some products from its reporting and prohibition requirements, but are they necessarily exempt from the labeling obligations as well?
No. As a
I was
group,
afraid you were gonna say that, Carla.
and
No,
it's not
no.
for lack of trying, but as a group, no, they are not. A few products are products with labeling requirements under FIFRA, veterinary products, medical devices, drugs, and packaging regulated by FDA. But the other product categories that are exempt from the reporting and prohibition requirements, uh, including products containing fluoropolymers, must be labeled.
So maybe let's just linger on that thought for a minute. You can have products that are exempt from reporting and prohibition requirements in New Mexico. And so what that kind of the Lord giveth, the labeling requirement taketh away. Are you saying you have to label products even though they are otherwise exempt from reporting and ultimate prohibition requirements there in 2032 or earlier? So it sounds like you're saying, yep, that's unfortunately the reality that a lot of people are not focusing on perhaps as much as they should. If that is true, Carla, what type of label are we talking about? And maybe you can give our listeners a little background on what the label requirement had early on been thought to include, because it is better, but it's still labeling any product to me is a big deal.
I know I've talked about this before, but if anyone's looking to kill, I don't know, a couple hours a day over the course of several days, there are YouTube videos of New Mexico's administrative rulemaking hearing in February on the proposed rule. Um, I found it unexpectedly fascinating. Unfortunately, a lot of it uh, was almost fluoropolymers being on trial.
Yeah.
Um, and, it did have things like objection, calls for a legal conclusion being made, I think, when maybe a toxicologist was on the stand.
And this was
So,
the state New Mexico regulatory body kind of quizzing experts that came in to present testimony on the labeling requirements. Is that the setup?
correct. It was before the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board. So the New Mexico uh, Environment Department had petitioned the board to approve its rule,
Mhm.
and there were several industry challengers. So both the agency and the challengers were able to present testimony from technical experts. Motions were submitted. So definitely one of the things that the challengers argued for was that um, if certain product categories were sort of deemed safe enough or it wasn't necessary to have them be reported or prohibit the PFAS in them, then why should they have to be labeled? In the fall, when the agency had announced the proposed rule, I believe it was also going to be part of a turn off the tap campaign that I think is intended to keep PFAS out of New Mexico.
Mhm.
And that initial proposed label would have included language, this uh, product or what contains PFAS, which is known to cause environmental and human health effects such as cancer. Um, for complex durable goods, manufacturers would have had to list each component that contains PFAS within the good.
Good
Uh,
grief.
and so the fact that this label would have been required, there are obviously right off the bat some First Amendment issues, some FIFRA issues. So even before the hearing, the agency had revised the rule twice and mostly regarding the labeling requirement. The Erlenmeyer flask with PFAS inside it, now there's no longer going to be an exclamation point after PFAS. and it's only going to be the flask. There's no longer the written warning in English and Spanish. Um, so it's simplified a lot. And now the argument is, well, this is just informational, and consumers, have a right to know. It's factual. It's we're not warning anybody. Um,
That's certainly the position. I think there are lots that might take that argument on, but I take your point. Maybe the Environmental, Improvement Board was hoping that some of the issues that labeling necessarily invite, including, as you noted, Carla, First Amendment, compelled commercial speech, and FIFRA, which always invites issues because of the requirements that federal FIFRA reporting and labeling requirements preempt anything else and disallow other labeling obligations. So the stripped down version might well be intended to address and head off some of those concerns, but it's still very much a warning, right? It's yes, it's factual, kind of, maybe, but I think reasonable people may disagree as to that also. And a lot of the PFAS in articles of one form or another may or may not be actually accessible to the purchaser of that article. So there are lots and lots of issues that lawyers and responsible others are thinking about with regard to these labeling requirements, and, they may well be the subject of a lawsuit down the road. Who knows?
Well, the fact that the label needs to be visible to the consumer before purchase.
Mhm.
The agency is very clear. It wants consumers to know about the PFAS before purchase and have the opportunity to make a choice. So uh, I'd mentioned the final requirement. It's the Erlenmeyer flask with the word PFAS inside, and that has to be clearly visible prior to sale. And that means that it's possible that your product is labeled, but that label, depending on the packaging, if you're selling the product in a box that does not have a plastic window allowing the customer to see the label, then the box must also be labeled.
So you said also label, not instead. We have been fielding an awful lot of questions from clients in that regard. Can you kind of go into that a little more?
Sure. Um, I think the final rule is clear that a label must be affixed to a product. And if the packaging hides the label, then, quote, the consumer packaging must also be labeled, end quote.
So packaging is also labeled, meaning packaging requires labeling, in addition to the required label on the product itself, and not instead of it, correct? Yikes. What about a bigger or more complex product? If you're talking about a single article that's not very complicated, that's one thing. But car manufacturers, what are they dealing with right now? Are they supposed to be putting a PFAS label on the steering wheels or in other parts of the dashboard? What can
I
you tell us there?
well, I would say right on the hood of the car, but I'm afraid that some listeners might think that's the real answer, and no, it's not. The final rule has a different labeling requirement for complex durable goods. Under the final rule, a complex durable good is a product that is a manufactured good composed of 100 or more manufactured components with an intended useful life of 5 or more years, where the product is typically not consumed, destroyed, or discarded after a single use.
So that would necessarily cover not only cars and motorcycles and boats, but items in, my household like AC units, hot water heaters, as well as home electronics like computers and TVs and hi-fi systems. And how are complex durable goods supposed to be labeled?
Again, because the consumer is supposed to have the information prior to purchase, um, manufacturers of a complex durable good must include the flask symbol on the consumer-facing product specification sheet that is available before purchase, as well as then also on consumer-facing operation and maintenance manuals. So I guess back to the car. I mean, does that mean it goes on the sheet on the window that lists the price breakdown, the miles
Yeah.
per gallon? Probably.
Yeah, well, I guess the important part is to, if it's a technical spec sheet or some sort of document that is visible and available to the consumer before purchase, it could well be on the window, it could be elsewhere. I guess that will remains to be seen. And I know a lot of maintenance manuals these days are not actually given to people. They're all available through a link on a computer. So presumably that's a little easier to address than the pre-purchase notice and labeling requirement. You mentioned, Carla, that a few products are exempt from the labeling requirement. Is it possible under the law to apply for a waiver from the labeling obligations?
There is a waiver option for products meeting two conditions. So, first, those products must be exempt from the reporting and prohibition requirements. And second, none of the product's material containing intentionally added PFAS will ever come into direct contact with a consumer while the product is being used as intended during the useful life of the product.
Okay, so among the complex durable goods example that we mentioned, some of those might meet these conditions. Let's say a computer or TV where the only PFAS that is present is a fluoropolymer, and it is used in an internal component such that the consumer will never come into direct contact unless they kind of invade the interior space and somehow disassemble something. But that strikes me as an extraordinary circumstance. So, under that scenario, do you think that type of internal use in a TV or a computer would qualify for a waiver?
I do. It has to be direct contact with the consumer while the product is being used as intended. And I
Okay.
don't think any TV manufacturer is expecting anybody to take a smart TV apart. Um, but that means manufacturers need to know what PFAS are present. Uh,
Hmm.
So if you have PFAS other than fluoropolymers, unless you're in one of those other categories exempt from the prohibition and reporting requirements, you're not eligible to apply for the waiver. But say it's fluoropolymers, or you're in one of those other categories, then you need to know like where the PFAS are in the component of the product to determine whether you qualify for a waiver.
So, if an entity does seem to qualify, when is the request due? And will the NMED have time, in your view, to review waiver requests before January 1, 2026? I mean, it's already mid May.
Waiver requests are due October 31, 2026, just hitting another holiday. NMED will consider the request approved pending review and will issue a final determination of whether to approve or deny the request by June 1, 2027. If the request is denied, manufacturers will have 90 days to label the product. Products manufactured up to the date of the denial may be sold without a label. Approved label waiver requests will expire 3 years after approval.
Okay, that's very clear. And to summarize deadlines related to New Mexico's requirements, both CUU proposals for products otherwise prohibited on January 1, 2027, and waiver requests are due Halloween, October 31, 2026. In each case, NMED will consider the request approved, which is really good news, pending review. Without a waiver, items in those initial product categories are prohibited as of January 1, 2027, and products manufactured after January 1, 2027 must be labeled. Do we have that right?
You've got that exactly right. So, is this where I mentioned that updated reports are due to Minnesota on February 1, 2027? Minnesota's statute requires annual updates by February 1 each year. Updates are required only if a significant change was made to a product, new information was provided to a manufacturer, or a manufacturer has placed a new product containing intentionally added PFAS on the market. So the good news is if a reporter has no new information to report, then nothing is due.
That is good news, but I want everybody listening up now to, picture that exploding head because we're talking about labeling requirements as of products manufactured in New Mexico after January 1, 2027, and updates in Minnesota as of February 1, 2027. And I know the circumstances are limited, but there's just an awful lot of moving parts here. And I know when I focus on this and present it to groups, I do see a lot of exploding heads. So now that companies are reporting in Minnesota and those reports are publicly available, are there any next steps that companies may wish to consider undertaking, Carla? Presumably, consumers are going to find out that products that these reporters are manufacturing contain PFAS in a lot of products, well beyond Teflon pans. What are you telling clients that are reporting and perhaps, thinking, well, been there, done that, I'm all done. What about the communication side of the equation?
Well, I would have suggested that companies take steps to counter misconceptions and misinformation about the use of intentionally added PFAS in their products. And I imagine this as a fact sheet or a page on a company's website providing information about what PFAS are in the product, why the PFAS are there, and why the product is still safe to use. But I'm beginning to wonder if consumers are either being overwhelmed by information about PFAS or have instead switched their concern to other things. I mean, there's a lot in the news about microplastics, ultra processed foods, phthalates. Um, I, I don't know so much anymore.
And it is hard to handicap because of the overwhelming part. But you might want to spend just a second to explain to our listeners how easy it will be to capture and download into an Excel spreadsheet or other report format information that is, reported, certainly in Minnesota and elsewhere.
It's incredibly easy. You only need a computer with an internet connection. You don't even have to register on the website. And I think that was the agency's goal all along was that this information would be publicly available. Uh, the intent, at least for Minnesota, I think the agency or the state has been clear. The ultimate goal that is once consumers are aware of just how prevalent PFAS are in their products, they will pressure manufacturers to reformulate their products and remove the PFAS. So um, companies have already started reporting to Minnesota, and those reports are available online. As of last week, it was over 5,500 items, quote unquote. Items don't correlate to products because there is a line for each PFAS for a specific function in a product's component. So if one component has multiple PFAS or even just the same PFAS but multiple functions, there will be multiple lines for it. Uh, And unfortunately for manufacturers, one of the easier things to look for is to look for brand names. What are the names that you recognize? What are the products that are there? You can see right now what companies have registered, but that includes companies like us, other consultants, other law firms. Apple has registered. I'm going to assume that Apple will be reporting, particularly based on, Bose reported quite a bit about headphones and earbuds. And so I assume that probably means there are PFAS in my AirPods. I am going to continue using them. Based on the reported information, the PFAS are there in part um, as a to protect against flammability. So, that's a use I support. I also, it's embedded in the plastic. It's not leaching out into my ear. So companies need to be prepared, though, that this information is public, and will consumers work through what it means, or will they just see the brand name and see, oh my God, there are like 25 different line items for my favorite uh, widget. I can't possibly use this anymore. That sounds really bad.
Well, that's the concern. You are a uniquely sophisticated expert in these reporting, labeling, and prohibition matters, Carla. So you might want to prepare our listeners for what type of information you are actually going to see in, for example, the Minnesota reporting grid. It's the product in which the part is included, that there is a PFAS. It probably doesn't speciate what PFAS is there. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. What its function is, what concentration it might be found in. Is all that information carefully laid out, or is it a whole lot of don't know, or all I know is there's PFAS in this part, and I can't tell you much more than that?
It depends. There is probably more unknown than
Mhm,
I would have expected, but manufacturers are working. Do their suppliers know? Do the suppliers know? Um, so there are, I mean, I think it's more than 1,000 different PFAS, um, within the database that you can select from. Uh, the agency, will add more if you're trying to report something that's not there.
mhm.
Um, there are ranges you need to report for your PFAS. So, less than 0.1%. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, but there are some with much higher ranges. And I think that might be something like a solvent, where I imagine it's um, not a significant, like, the volume of the solvent itself is very small, it's internal, the consumer won't be exposed. But again, what will the consumer see online, and what
Right.
conclusions will they draw? Seeing uh, that really high percentage can maybe be alarming, but it will be hard. I guess companies need to start preparing now. How can you break that down simply and put that on your website? I think a lot of people, if they're using AI these days to research things, well, the AI is going off what information it finds on the internet, for better or worse. And I have seen a lot of bad interpretations of
That you
scientific
have.
information by AI. So how do you counter that? Well, I mean, I think that's where companies maybe do need to put public facing information for AI to find in a search. I don't know how long it will take to sort of counter or push back against misinformation. Um, I've I've had a certain frustration where, the AI wants Wikipedia to be like a top source. And, for our work, no, there, you should
It
not
is
be
not
citing to
right.
Wikipedia.
Exactly. Well, I think that gets back to having what we urge clients to at least think about is having a communications strategy, because when all of this information becomes widely available, it invites, to me, a million different questions, and it would behoove people to think about having on the ready, a standby statement or some frequently asked questions or some additional information to allow your customers to make some informed judgments about products that contain PFAS, a class of chemicals that is as diverse as the day is long. It includes thousands of chemicals, many of which are not harmful, but because they share a definition, a narrative definition that applies, they're part of a class of chemicals that are now presumptively bad. Like it or not, or as to use your expression, Carla, for better or worse, there's, in the eyes of many, no good PFAS, which is, of course, the underlying principle for these reporting programs and labeling obligations is to get the word out there so consumers know what products contain PFAS. But that's not a lot of information and certainly gives rise to inferences that are adverse to the manufacturer and the type of PFAS that might be included in a product. And to be ready to rejoin those inferences, it seems to me anyway, and I think you agree, Carla, it would be helpful to have some information available to address the almost certain questions that are likely to come up in a big way, this year and going on into the future.
I think companies have been able to maybe ride out, um, a certain amount of publicity. I have researched for a couple of the brands, certainly the brands that stood out to me, that had already been reported to Minnesota, and didn't see anything on their website. So I think there will only be more publicity, though, about the products being reported. In part of preparing for today's podcast, and looking for how companies had responded, it's finding other sort of clickbaity headlines, the 81 headphones and earbuds that contain toxic chemicals. And yet the chemicals that were found, I mean, actually, they were talking about, I think, BPA and BPS, bisphenol A and
Mhm.
bisphenol S. PFAS was really not, it was just sort of an aside. It was not the predominant chemical. And yet I don't know, so I think companies, unfortunately, have had to, how do you respond to these sort of always attacks for one front or another? Well, you probably don't respond to all. But I think this reporting scheme is going to be something different. I think it's probably more than the agencies expected, um, more than the legislatures expected when they enacted these statutes. You know, I think we're all going to find out there are a lot more PFAS in a lot more places than we
Right.
appreciated. But I
So
think a lot
true.
of those uses we also support. Um,
Mhm.
if it's a small quantity that's contained within my smart TV, um, what is it that I want? Do I want to go back to tube TVs? I mean, is it possible to have a TV that's affordable that doesn't have it? Um, is there a market? Are manufacturers going to shift production because people will be clamoring for PFAS-free TVs or audio equipment, or motorcycles? I don't know. I sort of doubt it. Uh, I think it's going to be just overwhelming. So then it's going to be on the part of, is it going to be NGOs, reporters? Who is going to take that reported information and craft a story or a news item that will be understandable? And uh, I think that's where manufacturers, what is your story? Or you have a good reason for using the PFAS, presumably. It's not just because it was easy or convenient. There's a very particular function that the PFAS serves that's not available from another chemical. So tell us, why? Why is it there? What does it do?
And as you say, this is in part to let consumers know what products they are purchasing and using, whether they contain PFAS or not, and then consumers can make up their minds about continuing to purchase the product and use it as intended because they have satisfied themselves that there's no problem. Or not. I mean, that's exactly the objective of a lot of these reporting obligations. And ultimately the product prohibition, coming up in 2032. So, Carla, you've covered an awful lot of territory in a very short period of time. I know we here at the firm have a PFAS resource center. You write frequently on state PFAS requirements. We've got a federal PFAS reporting obligation that we haven't talked about here. We'll save that for another podcast when that rule comes out in final, if it comes out in final, before we all disappear. But where might you direct listeners to getting more information on all of these state reporting, labeling, and prohibition requirements?
Well, I mean, it's hard for companies and manufacturers to, so many are global these days, and to then have to deal with these very particular and very different state requirements. So if you're within a sector that has a trade association,
Mhm.
join it. They are going to be working and tracking this for its members. It's in their interest for their members to comply. Companies, I think, they want to be good stewards for the most part. And so, join the association, I guess, read or skim the tedious briefings to stay aware of deadlines. Um, I think Minnesota open to questions. So if you're having trouble, at the moment, I think the states are more open to education and assistance. I don't think any state is looking to enforce right off the bat with
Yeah, I
significant
agree.
fines. Um, and safer states, they track
Mhm.
legislation. You can limit it to enacted legislation. Um, you can see what's just current in this term. I guess the good news is I think more legislatures should be wrapping up their terms. Last time I checked, which was a week or two ago, I think about half the states were still in session, but I think a lot wrap up in May and June. So hopefully there won't be a whole lot of new requirements enacted this year. But, next year, whole new session. And I do think as a couple states already have, reporting or labeling requirements, other states may enact them. Hey, you reported to Minnesota, we'll waive that reporting requirement for you since there's substantially equivalent information available. Um, you know, uh, if you've labeled for New Mexico, I guess hopefully no other state is going to enact something that's like a skull with crossbones with PFAS, that the Erlenmeyer flask with PFAS would be acceptable. Um, but it's a
We
lot.
don't know.
It's hard. Well, this is where my favorite emoji, the shrug emoji, I don't know.
Well, I guess the bottom line is there are lots of places that you can get information. Carla noted a few. Come to our own website at www.lawbc.com. We have a ton of information, blog entries on all of these ongoing reporting obligations. There's no dearth of opportunities to educate yourself. I guess part of our goal in having this podcast was just to make sure that our listeners are well aware of this fast changing, very challenging area of the law. Prohibitions, labeling, reporting obligations for PFAS. At some point in time, we may have 50 different programs in 50 different states, which is not desirable, but it may be inevitable. And staying on top of the requirements is the key. As Carla indicated, I don't think there's going to be a big push for enforcement, but there's going to be an awfully big push for educating um, entities that are deeply opposed to the use of PFAS, health organizations, NGOs, competitors, you name it, there are lots of opportunities for mischief with these data, for good mischief or bad mischief. And so the goal is to be aware of what these obligations are and to manage them prudently. Any final words, Carla, you'd like to add?
No, we eh, decided to do this podcast because I think I started putting together what are all the deadlines between now and February 1, 2027. And,
There are a
it
lot.
is a lot.
Right.
So companies need to be prepared. If you need an extension, request an extension. Um, if you're eligible for a waiver, New Mexico's final rule is out now. Um, Review it, see what information you need to compile if you think you might qualify, and, get that application in.
Carla, you are a font of information. I said you had an encyclopedic understanding of these requirements, and you do. And I'm so grateful for your wisdom and your ability to communicate these obligations as clearly as you do. Thank you for joining us today, and really just keep up the excellent work. You do a great job for our clients, and you've done a great service for our listeners.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure to speak with you about PFAS.
Thanks, Carla. My thanks again to Carla for sharing her impressive knowledge of state PFAS restrictions and how to stay ahead of these aggressive requirements. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.